The day we buried Dad, the rain came down like judgment itself across the Tennessee hills. I stood there watching them lower his pine box into the red clay earth, my sister Catherine's hand gripping mine so tight I thought she might break my fingers. We'd been expecting this moment for months, ever since the doctors in Nashville told us the cancer had spread too far to fight. But nothing prepares you for the hollow sound of dirt hitting wood, or the way your whole world can change with the reading of a will. Dad always said the land would keep us together, but as I stared at that torn letter in my trembling hands 3 days later, I realized he might have been wrong about a lot of things. Catherine got the farmhouse, the good pasture land, and the prize-winning cattle that made our family name worth something in Hickman County. She got the John Deere tractor that still ran like a dream, the hay barn that could store enough feed for winter, and the respect that came with owning prime Tennessee soil. All I got was Jasper, a 20-year-old mule with a bad leg and a worse attitude, along with half of a letter that looked like it had been torn apart in anger or desperation. The lawyer, Mr. Henley, handed me that fragment with apologetic eyes, saying Dad had specifically requested I receive it exactly as it was found in his desk drawer. As I unfolded the yellowed paper, I could make out only scattered words and phrases that made no sense together. Standing in the shadow of the farmhouse that was no longer mine, I felt the weight of betrayal settling in my chest like a stone. Catherine was already talking to the bank about expanding operations, her voice carrying across the yard with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted their place in the world. But something about that torn letter nagged at me. The way Dad's handwriting seemed urgent in the fragments I could read. There were mentions of the real treasure, what Catherine doesn't know, and forgive me, son, scattered across the torn edges like pieces of a puzzle I was meant to solve. Maybe Dad's final gift wasn't the land or the livestock, but something else entirely. Something hidden in the mystery of why he'd torn this letter and left it for me to find. The morning after the will reading, I loaded what little I owned into the back of my beat-up Ford pickup and prepared to leave the only home I'd ever known. Catherine stood on the wraparound porch like she owned it, which legally speaking, she now did, watching me with those cold blue eyes that reminded me too much of our mother. She'd always been the golden child, the one who helped Dad with the books and knew every head of cattle by name. I was just the hired hand who happened to share the family blood. At least that's how it felt growing up in her shadow. The morning sun caught the red highlights in her auburn hair, making her look almost regal against the white columns of the house our great-grandfather had built with his own hands. "You don't have to leave, Thomas," she called out, but her voice lacked any real warmth or conviction. "There's always work here for family, even if you're not the owner anymore." The words stung worse than if she'd told me to get lost, because they confirmed what I'd always suspected, that she saw me as nothing more than cheap labor. I'd spent 32 years of my life working this land, getting up before dawn to milk cows and mend fences, bleeding and sweating for every acre. But blood meant nothing when it came to Dad's final decision, and I wondered if Catherine had been whispering in his ear during those long months of sickness. Old Jasper stood in the barn doorway, his gray coat matted and his left hind leg favoring from an injury he'd gotten years ago tangling with barbed wire. He was the most ornery, stubborn creature God ever put on this earth, but he was mine now. The only thing of value Dad had left me. As I approached with his halter, Jasper snorted and tossed his head like he knew exactly what kind of raw deal we'd both gotten. His dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, and I swear he understood the injustice of our situation better than most people would. When I finally got the halter on him, he nuzzled my shoulder in what might have been sympathy or just a search for sugar cubes. The torn letter felt heavy in my shirt pocket as I led Jasper toward the trailer I'd borrowed from my neighbor, Bill Murphy. Every step away from the house felt like walking through quicksand, each movement requiring more effort than it should. This land held every memory I had of Dad, teaching me to drive the tractor when I was 10, showing me how to read the signs of weather in the sky, working side by side during harvest season when the air smelled like cut hay and possibility. Now those memories felt tainted by the knowledge that none of it had ever really been meant for me. Catherine came down from the porch as I was loading Jasper, her expensive boots clicking against the stone pathway Dad had laid himself 20 years ago. "Thomas, wait," she said, and for a moment her voice cracked with something that might have been regret. I found something else in Dad's room, something I think belongs to you. She held out a small wooden box, hand-carved and worn smooth by years of handling. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, was Dad's pocket watch. The one his grandfather had carried in the Civil War, the one I'd always assumed would go to the eldest child. The watch was solid silver, its case engraved with our family name and a date from 1863, when our ancestor had carried it through the Battle of Chickamauga. Dad used to let me hold it when I was small, telling me stories about how it had stopped a bullet meant for my great-great-grandfather's heart. He always said this should go to the child who understood the real value of time, Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. I think he meant it should go to someone who wasn't always in such a hurry to get somewhere else. Her words hit me like a physical blow, because I'd never told anyone about my dreams of leaving Tennessee, of seeing what lay beyond these rolling hills. As I closed the watch in my palm, I felt its steady tick against my skin like a heartbeat. Catherine stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself as if she were cold despite the warm September morning. "Take care of yourself, Thomas," she said, and this time I heard genuine sadness in her voice. "And take care of that stubborn mule. He's going to need you now more than ever." I wanted to say something to bridge the gap that had opened between us, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I simply nodded and climbed into my truck, the weight of the pocket watch in one hand and the mystery of the torn letter burning in my heart. The gravel road away from the farm stretched out before me like a question mark, disappearing around a bend lined with oak trees that were just beginning to show their fall colors. In my rearview mirror, I watched the farmhouse grow smaller until it was just a white dot against the green hillside. Jasper rode quietly in the trailer behind me, probably wondering what kind of fool adventure we were embarking on together. But as I felt the torn letter crinkle in my pocket and heard Dad's watch ticking steadily in my hand, I began to suspect that maybe, just maybe, the real inheritance had nothing to do with land or livestock at all. I ended up renting a small cabin on the outskirts of Centerville, about 40 miles from the family farm, in a hollow so narrow the sun only hit it for a few hours each day. The place belonged to an old-timer named Ezra Hutchins, who'd lost his wife the previous winter and needed the extra income to keep his own small farm running. It wasn't much. Just 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a barn that leaned so far to one side it looked like a strong wind might finish it off. But it was mine for $60 a month, and Ezra threw in pasture space for Jasper as part of the deal. The old mule seemed to approve of his new accommodations, immediately claiming the shadiest corner of the field and establishing himself as the undisputed king of Ezra's 3 remaining chickens. The first week passed in a blur of unpacking and trying to figure out what came next with my life. I'd saved up enough money over the years to last a few months without work, but that wouldn't stretch forever. Every morning I sat at the small kitchen table, spreading out the torn letter and trying to make sense of the fragments. "The real treasure lies where the mockingbird sings twice," one piece read. Another fragment mentioned, "the old oak that split in the storm of '78, and count 13 paces north from the lightning scar." It sounded like a treasure map from a children's book, but knowing Dad, every word had a purpose and meaning I wasn't seeing yet. Ezra proved to be good company and an endless source of stories about the area going back 60 years or more. He'd known my father as a young man, before Dad inherited the farm and became too important to associate with folks from the Hollow. "Your daddy wasn't always the serious type," Ezra told me one evening as we sat on his front porch sharing a bottle of Tennessee whiskey. "Used to come fishing down at Piney Creek with a girl from town, back before he married your mother. Pretty little thing named Sarah May. Had hair the color of autumn leaves and a laugh that could charm birds from the trees." The old man's eyes grew distant as he spoke, and I wondered if there were chapters of Dad's life I'd never known about. That night, lying in the narrow bed that came with the cabin, I stared at the ceiling and thought about all the secrets a man might keep locked away in his heart. Dad had always been private, never one to talk about his feelings or his past beyond the basic facts we needed to know. But the torn letter suggested there were things he'd wanted to tell me, things important enough to put in writing but painful enough to tear apart before he could bring himself to share them. The pocket watch ticked steadily on the nightstand beside me, measuring out the seconds of my uncertainty with mechanical precision. The next morning I decided to take Jasper for a ride through the countryside, partly to give him some exercise and partly to clear my own head. Despite his age and his bad leg, the old mule still had spirit, picking his way carefully down the rocky paths that crisscrossed the hills like veins through marble. We followed Piney Creek for several miles, the water running clear and cold over limestone shelves worn smooth by decades of spring floods. This was the creek Ezra had mentioned, where Dad used to come courting with the mysterious Sarah May, and I found myself looking for signs of their presence in the landscape. About 3 miles upstream from Ezra's place, I found something that made my heart race. An enormous oak tree that had clearly been split by lightning, its massive trunk divided right down the middle but somehow still alive and growing. The bark around the split was blackened and twisted, creating a distinctive scar that would be visible from a considerable distance. I dismounted from Jasper and pulled out the torn letter, comparing the words I could make out with the scene before me. The old oak that split in the storm of '78. This had to be the tree Dad was referring to, and suddenly his cryptic directions began to make sense. Standing at the base of the split oak, I counted 13 paces north just as the letter fragment instructed, my boots crunching through the fallen leaves that carpeted the forest floor. At the 13th step, I found myself standing before a smaller tree, a young maple that couldn't have been more than 15 years old. But as I looked closer, I noticed something unusual about the ground around its base. The earth was slightly mounded, as if it had been disturbed and then carefully restored. My pulse quickened as I realized that Dad's treasure might not be metaphorical at all, but something actually buried here in this hidden corner of the Tennessee wilderness. I spent the rest of that day thinking about what I'd discovered, my mind racing with possibilities and questions. That evening I called Catherine from the payphone outside Murphy's General Store, the only place in the hollow with reliable phone service. I found something, I told her, describing the oak tree and the suspicious mound of earth. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before she spoke, her voice tight with something I couldn't identify. "Thomas, maybe you should just let sleeping dogs lie," she said finally. "Dad's gone, and digging up the past won't bring him back." But her words only made me more determined to uncover whatever secret Dad had buried beneath that young maple tree. I drove to the hardware store in Centerville the next morning and bought a good shovel, a metal detector that cost more than I probably should have spent, and a heavy-duty flashlight. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, asked if I was starting a garden, and I just smiled and said something about clearing stumps. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon studying topographical maps of the area, trying to understand the lay of the land around the split oak and what might have made Dad choose that particular spot. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just some wild goose chase, but a carefully planned legacy he'd left specifically for me. Ezra noticed my nervous energy and finally cornered me while I was tending to Jasper that evening. "Son, you've got the look of a man carrying secrets," he said, leaning against the barn door with his arms crossed. "Known that look since I was your age. Seen it plenty of times in the mirror myself." I found myself telling him about the torn letter and the split oak, watching his weathered face for signs of recognition or surprise. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, chewing on a piece of straw and staring off toward the distant hills. "There's things about your daddy you don't know," Ezra finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Things that happened before you and your sister were born, back when he was young and foolish like the rest of us." He told me about the summer of 1978, when a terrible storm had swept through the county, destroying crops and killing livestock. "Your daddy lost everything that year. The whole farm nearly went under. But somehow, someway he came up with enough money to save it all. Never did say where that money came from, but folks had their suspicions." The old man's words sent a chill down my spine as I began to understand the implications of what he was telling me. "You think Dad found something back then, something valuable enough to save the farm?" I asked, but Ezra just shrugged and walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. That night, I lay awake listening to the wind in the trees and wondering what kind of man my father had really been. The pocket watch ticked beside me like a guilty conscience, measuring out the hours until I could return to the split oak and uncover the truth. I rose before dawn and loaded my tools into the truck, along with enough water and food for a full day's work. Jasper seemed to sense my excitement, prancing around the pasture like a colt instead of the ancient mule he was. The drive to the oak tree felt longer than usual, every mile stretching out like an eternity as my imagination ran wild with possibilities. What if Dad had found Confederate gold, or stumbled across a bank robbery cache, or discovered some natural treasure hidden in these hills for generations? The metal detector proved worthless in the rocky soil around the maple tree, its electronic squealing drowned out by the iron-rich ground that seemed to set it off every few seconds. So I put it aside and started digging the old-fashioned way, one shovelful at a time, working methodically in a grid pattern around the base of the young tree. The work was harder than I'd expected, the Tennessee clay hard-packed and full of roots that caught my shovel like grabbing hands. By noon, I'd dug 3 holes without finding anything more interesting than a few rusty nails and a child's marble that might have been there for decades. But just as I was beginning to think I'd misinterpreted Dad's clues, my shovel struck something solid about 2 feet down on the north side of the maple. The sound was different from hitting a rock, more hollow like metal or wood. My heart hammering, I carefully cleared away the dirt to reveal the corner of what looked like an old ammunition box, the kind military surplus stores sold for storing camping gear. The metal was pitted with rust but still intact, and it was heavy enough that I needed both hands to lift it from the hole. I carried the box to a fallen log and sat down, my hands trembling as I worked at the corroded latches. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas that had kept most of the moisture out, I found a bundle of documents, a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins, and another letter. This one complete and unfolded. The documents were old deeds and land surveys, yellowed with age but still legible. But it was the letter that made my breath catch in my throat, because it was addressed to me in Dad's careful handwriting, dated just 3 months before his death. The letter began simply, "Thomas, if you're reading this, then you've proven yourself worthy of the truth." As I read on, my understanding of everything I thought I knew about my family began to crumble like autumn leaves. Dad revealed that the farm hadn't originally belonged to our family at all, but had been won in a poker game by my great-grandfather in 1863. The family land we'd been so proud of was built on what amounted to a lucky hand of cards and a desperate Confederate soldier's bad judgment. But that wasn't the most shocking revelation. Dad went on to explain that he'd discovered this truth in 1978, along with something else that had changed everything. The leather pouch contained 23 gold coins, each one stamped with dates from the 1860s and bearing the distinctive marks of Confederate currency. But these weren't ordinary coins. They were part of a legendary cache that historians had been searching for over a century. According to Dad's letter, the Confederate soldier who'd lost the farm in that poker game had buried his family's gold reserves somewhere on the property before fleeing north to avoid capture. My great-grandfather had died without ever finding the treasure, but Dad had discovered the hiding place purely by accident while installing a new fence line in 1978. The letter went on to explain how Dad had used some of the gold to save the farm during the terrible storm that year, carefully selling individual coins through antique dealers in Nashville and Memphis to avoid suspicion. He'd kept the location secret for decades, gradually removing small amounts as needed for major improvements and emergencies. But the bulk of the treasure remained hidden, and according to his calculations, there were still several hundred coins buried in a location that only I would be able to find using clues he'd carefully constructed from our shared memories. "Catherine was always your mother's daughter," the letter continued, "practical and focused on the present. But you, Thomas, have always been a dreamer, someone who understands that the real value of something isn't always what it appears to be on the surface. The land I left her will provide security and respectability, but the treasure I'm leaving you represents something more precious. The freedom to choose your own path without being tied down by other people's expectations." Reading those words, I felt a mixture of vindication and overwhelming sadness, realizing that Dad had understood me better than I'd ever known. He'd seen my restlessness, my desire to explore the world beyond Tennessee's borders, and instead of trying to chain me to the family land, he'd given me the means to fly free. But the letter also revealed a burden I wasn't sure I was ready to carry. The knowledge that our family's prosperity had been built on luck and lost treasure rather than honest work and good character. The final paragraph of the letter contained the most cryptic clue yet. Remember the summer you turned 16, when we fixed the old stone bridge after the flash flood? Remember what I told you about the foundation stones? How the strongest structures are built on things that can't be seen. The rest of your inheritance lies where the water runs deepest, beneath the stones that have stood the longest. I read those words 3 times, my mind racing as I tried to decode their meaning and connect them to specific memories from that summer 21 years ago. The stone bridge Dad was referring to crossed a narrow section of Piney Creek about a mile upstream from where I'd found the split oak. It was an old structure, probably built in the 1800s, with massive limestone blocks that had been quarried locally and fitted together without mortar. That summer, a sudden storm had washed out the approach on one side, and Dad and I had spent 2 weeks rebuilding the stone causeway that led to the bridge proper. I remembered his lecture about foundations, how the visible parts of any structure were only as strong as the hidden supports beneath. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the trees, I carefully wrapped everything back in the oiled canvas and returned it to the ammunition box. But instead of reburying it, I loaded the box into my truck along with my tools. Whatever secrets lay beneath the old stone bridge would have to wait for another day. I needed time to process what I'd already discovered and decide how to handle the knowledge that my entire family history was built on a foundation of half-truths and hidden treasure. The drive back to Ezra's cabin felt surreal, like I was floating through a dream where nothing was quite what it seemed. I kept glancing at the ammunition box on the passenger seat, unable to fully believe that it contained enough gold to change my life forever. But even more unsettling was the realization that Dad had been keeping this secret for over 40 years, smiling and playing the role of honest farmer while sitting on a fortune that technically belonged to someone else's family. That evening, I sat on Ezra's front porch with a glass of whiskey and Dad's complete letter spread out on the wooden table between us. The old man read it slowly, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the more difficult passages. When he finished, he set the papers down and stared out at the darkening hills for a long time before speaking. "Well, I'll be damned," he finally said, shaking his head in amazement. "Always wondered how your daddy managed to bounce back so quick from that storm in '78. Makes sense now, knowing what we know. The question is, what do I do with this information?" I asked, voicing the dilemma that had been eating at me all afternoon. "This gold doesn't really belong to my family, Ezra. It belonged to some Confederate soldier's family, people who probably died poor while Dad was using their treasure to improve his farm." The moral weight of the situation felt heavier than the ammunition box, and I found myself wishing Dad had taken his secret to the grave instead of passing it on to me. Ezra refilled our glasses and settled back in his rocking chair, the wood creaking softly as he considered my words. "Son, that Confederate soldier lost this land and everything on it in a card game over 160 years ago," he said finally. "Whatever gold he buried here stopped belonging to his family the moment he wagered it all on a pair of jacks. Your great-grandfather won it fair and square, and your daddy found what was rightfully his to find. Don't go borrowing guilt that ain't yours to carry." His words made sense from a legal standpoint, but they didn't ease the moral complexity of the situation. I'd grown up believing that hard work and honest dealing were the foundations of our family's success, only to discover that luck and hidden treasure had played a much larger role than anyone had admitted. "But what about Catherine?" I asked. "She has no idea that the farm's prosperity came from anything other than good farming and smart business decisions. Don't I owe it to her to tell her the truth?" "That's between you and your conscience," Ezra replied, but his tone suggested he had strong opinions on the matter. "Your daddy left her the land and the visible success because that's what she needed. Security and social standing in the community. He left you the treasure because he knew you'd need something different. The freedom to make your own choices without being tied down by expectations." The old man paused to sip his whiskey, his eyes thoughtful in the gathering darkness. "Seems to me he knew his children better than either of you gave him credit for." The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the grass like scattered diamonds. I loaded my tools back into the truck and drove to the stone bridge, my mind still wrestling with questions of right and wrong. The morning mist rising from Piney Creek gave the whole scene an otherworldly quality, as if I were stepping back in time to witness the original burial of the Confederate gold. The bridge itself looked exactly as I remembered from that summer when I was 16. Solid and timeless, built to last for generations. I parked beside the creek and walked slowly across the bridge, running my hands along the ancient limestone blocks and trying to recall Dad's exact words from that long-ago conversation. He talked about foundation stones, about how the strongest structures were built on things that couldn't be seen. At the time, I'd thought he was just giving me a general lesson about life, but now I realized he'd been planting a very specific clue in my memory, trusting that I'd remember it when the time came. The bridge was about 30 feet long and 8 feet wide, supported by 4 massive stone pillars that extended down into the creek bed. The water level was lower than usual due to the dry September weather, exposing portions of the foundation that were normally underwater. As I studied the structure more carefully, I noticed that one of the middle pillars had a slightly different construction than the others. The stones were fitted more loosely, with gaps between them that looked like they might have been disturbed and rebuilt at some point. Getting down into the creek bed required a careful scramble down the muddy bank, but once I was there, I could see clear evidence that the loose stones had been moved relatively recently. The mortar between them was newer than the rest of the bridge, and there were scrape marks on the limestone that looked fresh despite years of weather and water flow. My heart began to race as I realized that this pillar might be hollow, designed to hide something valuable in a place where no one would think to look. The loose stones came away easier than I'd expected, revealing a carefully constructed hollow space within the bridge pillar itself. Dad had been clever about it, removing stones from the upstream side where the cavity wouldn't be visible from the road or the walking path across the bridge. Inside the hollow, wrapped in multiple layers of waterproof canvas and plastic, I found 3 more ammunition boxes identical to the one I discovered the day before. Each box was heavy enough to require both hands, and the metallic clinks from inside left no doubt about their contents. Working quickly before anyone might come along and discover what I was doing, I loaded all 3 boxes into my truck and carefully replaced the stones in the bridge pillar. The fit wasn't perfect, but unless someone knew exactly what to look for, the disturbance wouldn't be noticeable to casual observers. By the time I finished, my clothes were soaked with creek water and mud, but my hands were shaking with excitement rather than cold. If these boxes contained the same type of gold coins as the first one, I was looking at a fortune that would change not just my life, but potentially the lives of generations to come. Back at the cabin, I spread old newspapers across Ezra's kitchen table and opened the boxes one by one, hardly believing what I was seeing. The first box contained 97 gold coins from various periods in the 1800s, along with several pieces of jewelry that looked like family heirlooms. A woman's wedding ring, a man's pocket watch similar to but older than the one Catherine had given me, and a delicate gold locket containing faded photographs of people I didn't recognize. The second box held Confederate paper money in remarkable condition, along with more coins and what appeared to be stock certificates from companies that had probably gone out of business before the Civil War ended. But it was the third box that took my breath away completely. Along with more gold coins, over 200 of them. There was a hand-drawn map of the local area showing the locations of what appeared to be multiple burial sites. The map was annotated in faded ink with notes like family silver, emergency funds, and Sarah's dowry, suggesting that the Confederate soldier had buried his family's entire wealth in caches scattered across several square miles of Tennessee countryside. At the bottom of the map, in different handwriting that I recognized as Dad's, was a note. Thomas. I found 5 of the 7 sites. The other 2 are yours to discover if you choose. Your father. I sat staring at that map for what felt like hours, trying to wrap my mind around the magnitude of what I'd inherited. This wasn't just a small cache of emergency funds. It was the accumulated wealth of an entire antebellum Southern family, hidden away to prevent it from falling into Union hands during the war. The soldier who'd buried it had probably planned to return after the conflict ended, but something had prevented him from reclaiming his family's treasure. Death, injury, or simply the chaos of Reconstruction had left the gold and silver hidden in the Tennessee hills for over a century. The moral questions that had been troubling me became even more complex as I studied the map and the family heirlooms. These weren't anonymous treasures buried by faceless historical figures. They were personal possessions that had belonged to real people with names and faces, people who'd probably died poor while their wealth lay hidden in the ground. The photographs in the locket showed a young woman with sad eyes and a man in a Confederate uniform, probably the soldier himself and his wife or sweetheart. Looking at their faces, I felt like I was stealing from the dead. But then I remembered Ezra's words about the poker game and the passage of time, about how ownership could change hands through luck and circumstance just as legitimately as through inheritance or purchase. The Confederate soldier had wagered everything on a card game and lost. Not just the land, but everything buried on it. My great-grandfather had won it fairly, even if he'd never known the full extent of what he'd acquired. And Dad had spent decades carefully managing the treasure, using it to preserve and improve the family farm rather than squandering it on personal luxuries. That evening, I walked out to the pasture where Jasper was grazing and leaned against the fence rail, watching the old mule crop grass in the fading light. He looked up at me with those intelligent dark eyes, and I swear he understood the weight of the decision I was facing. "What do you think, old boy?" I asked him, and he snorted and went back to his grass, as if to say that gold was a human problem and he had more practical concerns to worry about. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was overthinking a situation that was simpler than I wanted to make it. The pocket watch Dad had left me ticked steadily in my shirt pocket, measuring out the seconds of my uncertainty. According to the will, Catherine had inherited the family land and the visible legacy of our father's work. But maybe the real inheritance wasn't about who got what, but about understanding the choices each of us was meant to make with what we'd been given. Catherine needed security and respectability. She got the farm and the social standing that came with it. I needed freedom and the chance to write my own story. And apparently, Dad had left me the means to do exactly that. The next few days passed in a blur of research and planning as I tried to decide what to do with my newfound wealth. I drove to the library in Nashville and spent hours reading about Confederate gold, Civil War history, and the legal implications of finding buried treasure. What I learned was both reassuring and troubling. Legally, anything found on private property belonged to the property owner, which meant Dad had been within his rights to claim the treasure when he found it. But morally, the situation remained as complicated as ever. I also researched the market value of Civil War-era gold coins and was stunned to discover that some of them were worth far more than their weight in gold due to their historical significance and rarity. A conservative estimate put the total value of what I'd found at somewhere between $2 and $3 million. Enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life without ever working another day. But instead of feeling elated, I found myself increasingly burdened by the responsibility of what to do with such wealth. The question of whether to tell Catherine about the treasure kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling while the pocket watch ticked beside my bed. She was my sister, and despite our differences, I loved her and wanted what was best for her. But she'd also made it clear that she saw me as nothing more than hired help, someone who'd never been worthy of inheriting any part of the family legacy. Would knowing about the treasure change her opinion of Dad? Or would it just make her angry that she hadn't received a share of the gold along with the land? On Friday morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called Catherine and asked if I could come by the farm to talk. There was a long pause before she agreed, her voice cautious and uncertain. "Is everything all right, Thomas?" she asked, and I could hear genuine concern beneath her usual cool demeanor. "You sound different somehow, like something's changed." I told her I'd found some things that belonged to the family, things she needed to know about, and we agreed to meet that evening after she finished her work with the cattle. The drive back to the family farm felt like traveling through time, every familiar landmark triggering memories of the life I'd left behind just 2 weeks earlier. The farmhouse looked the same as always, solid and welcoming in the golden light of late afternoon, but I felt like a stranger approaching it now. Catherine was waiting on the front porch, and I noticed she'd changed out of her work clothes into a blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. For a moment, she looked like the little sister I remembered from childhood, before life and circumstances had driven us apart. "You look good," she said as I climbed the porch steps, and I realized it was probably true. The stress and uncertainty of the past few weeks had actually been liberating in some ways, freeing me from the weight of expectations and disappointments that had been crushing me for years. "So do you," I replied, and meant it. Without the barrier of competing for Dad's approval between us, we seemed able to see each other more clearly than we had in years. I'd brought one of the ammunition boxes with me, along with Dad's complete letter and the hand-drawn map. Catherine listened in stunned silence as I told her the whole story, from finding the torn letter fragment to discovering the treasure beneath the stone bridge. When I finished, she sat staring at the gold coins scattered across her kitchen table, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, anger, and something that might have been admiration. "He kept this secret for 40 years, she whispered, picking up one of the coins and turning it over in her palm. 40 years of living with this knowledge and never telling a soul. "The question is, what do we do now?" I asked, studying her face for clues about her reaction. "This treasure doesn't technically belong to either of us. It belonged to a Confederate family that lost it in a poker game over a century ago. But Dad used it to save and improve the farm, which means everything you inherited was built partly on this foundation." I paused, trying to find the right words. "I want to do the right thing, Catherine, but I'm not sure what that means anymore." Catherine was quiet for a long time, absently rolling one of the gold coins between her fingers while she processed everything I'd told her. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and thoughtful, lacking the sharp edge that had characterized most of our conversations over the years. "Do you know what I remember most about Dad?" she asked, not looking up from the coin. "It was the way he used to sit on this same porch every evening after supper, just staring out at the fields like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. I always thought it was because farming was such hard work, but now I wonder if it was this secret eating away at him." She stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the pasture where Dad's prize cattle grazed in the evening light. "He was a good man, Thomas, despite keeping this from us. Every improvement he made to this farm, every dollar he invested in better livestock or equipment, he was building something that would last beyond his own lifetime. Maybe he used Confederate gold to do it, but he turned that money into something productive and lasting instead of just spending it on himself." Her reflection in the window glass looked sad and wise, older than her 34 years. "I've been thinking about that torn letter you found first," she continued, turning back to face me. "Why do you think he tore it up? He could have just written you a complete letter explaining everything, but instead he made you work for the truth, made you prove you were worthy of it." She picked up another coin, this one bearing the date 1862 and the profile of a long-dead politician. "Maybe that was his way of making sure you understood the responsibility that comes with this kind of secret." I hadn't considered that possibility, but it made sense given Dad's character and his tendency to teach through experience rather than lecture. "You think he wanted me to struggle with the moral implications before I claimed the treasure?" I asked, and Catherine nodded slowly. "I think he knew that easy money corrupts people, but money that's earned, even if it's earned through solving puzzles and facing difficult choices, that kind of money might actually make someone stronger." She smiled for the first time since I'd arrived, a genuine expression that transformed her whole face. "There's something else," she said, reaching into a kitchen drawer and pulling out a manila envelope I hadn't seen before. "I lied to you about finding Dad's pocket watch in his room. The truth is, he gave it to me 3 days before he died, along with this envelope and specific instructions about when I should open it." She handed me the envelope, which was sealed and addressed to both of our names in Dad's distinctive handwriting. "He told me to wait until you came back with questions about your inheritance, and to only open it if you'd actually found what he'd hidden for you." My hands were shaking as I opened the envelope and pulled out another letter, this one written on Dad's personal stationery and dated just 1 week before his death. "My dear children," it began, "if you're reading this together, then Thomas has discovered the treasure and Catherine has had the wisdom to share the final piece of the puzzle. I'm proud of you both for getting this far, and I hope you'll forgive an old man's elaborate scheme to ensure that my legacy reaches the right hands in the right way." The letter went on to explain Dad's reasoning in more detail than either of his previous messages had provided. He'd always intended for Catherine to inherit the farm because she had the practical skills and emotional temperament to manage it successfully, but he'd also known that traditional farming alone wouldn't be enough to keep the operation profitable in the changing economy of the 21st century. The treasure, he explained, was meant to provide the capital needed for expansion and modernization. Not just for Thomas to disappear with, but for both siblings to use in partnership. The real treasure, the letter concluded, isn't the gold itself, but the opportunity it represents for you to work together instead of apart. Catherine has the knowledge and skills to run a successful agricultural operation, while Thomas has the creativity and drive to explore new markets and opportunities. Together you could build something bigger and better than either of you could achieve alone. The choice, as always, is yours to make. The revelation of Dad's true intentions hit me like a physical blow, reshaping everything I thought I understood about his final wishes and my own future. Here I'd been agonizing over questions of ownership and morality, when the real test had been whether Catherine and I could overcome our differences and work together as partners. Dad hadn't just left me the means to escape Tennessee. He'd given both of us the opportunity to transform the family farm into something unprecedented, if we were brave enough to try. Catherine set the letter down and looked at me with eyes that held a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "What do you think, Thomas? Could we actually make this work? Or are we too different to be business partners?" Her question hung in the air between us like a challenge, loaded with years of sibling rivalry and misunderstanding. But for the first time in decades, I saw past the competitive dynamic that had defined our relationship and recognized the qualities that had made Dad believe we could succeed together. "I think," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully, "that we're different enough to complement each other instead of competing. You understand this land and this business better than anyone I know, while I've always been the one with crazy ideas about trying new things." I gestured toward the gold coins scattered across the table. "With this kind of capital, we could expand into organic farming, agritourism, maybe even renewable energy projects. The farm could become a model for sustainable agriculture instead of just another struggling operation." The excitement in Catherine's eyes told me she was already thinking along the same lines. "There's over 300 acres of marginal pasture on the south side that we've never been able to use effectively because of the terrain," she said, her voice gaining enthusiasm as she spoke. "But that same terrain would be perfect for a high-end hunting lodge or conference center. City people pay crazy money for authentic rural experiences, especially if they come with good food and comfortable accommodations." We talked until well past midnight, the conversation flowing more naturally than any we'd shared since childhood as we explored possibilities and began to trust each other with our dreams. Catherine had always been more ambitious than I'd given her credit for, but her ambitions had been constrained by the financial realities of traditional farming. The treasure would change all of that, providing the freedom to take risks and pursue innovations that might transform not just our farm, but the entire local economy. By the time I finally headed back to Ezra's cabin, we'd outlined a partnership agreement that would give Catherine controlling interest in the farming operations while making me responsible for new business development and expansion projects. The treasure would be converted gradually into investment capital, with both of us taking conservative salaries while reinvesting the majority of profits back into the operation. It wasn't the escape from Tennessee I'd always dreamed of, but it was something potentially more valuable. The chance to help build something meaningful while staying connected to the land that had shaped our family for generations. The drive through the dark hills felt different that night, less like fleeing from my past and more like returning to reclaim it on my own terms. Jasper was waiting for me in his pasture, and he nickered softly as I walked past his fence, as if he approved of whatever decisions I'd made during my absence. The old mule had been right to focus on practical concerns rather than getting caught up in abstract questions of ownership and morality. What mattered wasn't where the treasure had come from, but what we chose to do with it now. The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather and a sense of possibilities that I hadn't felt in years. I spent the day making phone calls to agricultural extension agents, sustainable farming consultants, and small business development specialists, gathering information about the feasibility of our various ideas. Most of the responses were encouraging, especially when I mentioned having access to significant investment capital. The South was experiencing a renaissance in artisanal agriculture and rural tourism, and Tennessee was particularly well positioned to capitalize on both trends. Ezra found me that evening sitting on his front porch with a legal pad covered in notes and calculations, planning out the transformation of everything I'd thought I'd lost. "You look like a man who's found his purpose," he observed, settling into his rocking chair with his usual glass of whiskey. When I told him about the partnership with Catherine and our plans for the farm, he smiled and nodded as if he'd been expecting this outcome all along. "Your daddy would be proud," he said simply. He always believed the best treasures were the ones you had to work for, and the ones you shared with people you cared about. 6 months later, I stood in the same spot where I'd dug up the first ammunition box, but the landscape around me had been transformed beyond recognition. The old oak tree that had been split by lightning now served as the centerpiece of a carefully designed meditation garden, part of the wellness retreat center that Catherine and I had built on the marginal pasture land. The Confederate treasure had funded not just the construction, but also the infrastructure improvements needed to support our expanding operations. New roads, upgraded utilities, and a state-of-the-art conference facility that was already booked solid through the following year. Catherine had thrown herself into the organic farming certification process with the same intensity she'd once brought to traditional cattle operations, transforming our agricultural practices while maintaining the productivity that kept us profitable. The transition hadn't been easy. Organic farming required more labor and attention to detail than conventional methods. But the premium prices we commanded for certified organic beef and produce more than justified the extra effort. We'd also diversified into heritage vegetables, artisanal cheese production, and a farm-to-table restaurant that showcased everything we grew on the property. My own role had evolved into something I'd never expected but found deeply satisfying. Part business developer, part educator, and part storyteller for visitors who came seeking authentic rural experiences. The hunting lodge Catherine had envisioned had become a comprehensive retreat center offering everything from corporate team-building exercises to cooking classes taught by local chefs. We'd partnered with universities to offer sustainable agriculture workshops, and the waiting list for spots in our programs stretched months into the future. The most surprising development had been the relationship that had grown between Catherine and me as we worked together to build something neither of us could have achieved alone. The competitive dynamic that had poisoned our childhood interactions had been replaced by genuine respect and affection, as we learned to appreciate each other's strengths without feeling threatened by our differences. We still disagreed about plenty of things, but now those disagreements felt productive rather than destructive, pushing us both to consider perspectives we might have missed on our own. Jasper had become something of a celebrity among our visitors, his ornery personality and advanced age making him a favorite subject for photographs and stories. We'd built him a custom shelter in the pasture closest to the main lodge, where guests could visit with him and hear the tale of how a worthless old mule had led me to discover the treasure that transformed our entire operation. He seemed to enjoy the attention, though he maintained his dignity by refusing to perform tricks or submit to being petted by strangers. The moral questions that had once kept me awake at night had been resolved through action rather than philosophy. We'd used a portion of the treasure to establish a scholarship fund for local students pursuing agricultural education, and we'd partnered with historical societies to properly document and preserve the Confederate artifacts we'd discovered. The gold coins had been gradually converted into legitimate business investments, their origin becoming less important than the positive impact they were having on our community and economy. But perhaps the most meaningful resolution had come through my relationship with the land itself. Instead of fleeing Tennessee for distant horizons, I'd learned to see the rolling hills and limestone creeks as a canvas for creativity and innovation. The freedom I'd always sought wasn't geographical. It was the freedom to build something meaningful using my own skills and vision. The treasure had provided the capital, but the real wealth lay in the opportunity to create a legacy that would outlast any individual lifetime. As the sun set over the conference center and retreat lodge that now occupied the hills where I'd once felt trapped, I pulled Dad's pocket watch from my vest and checked the time. In an hour, Catherine and I would be hosting a dinner for agricultural extension agents from 3 states, sharing our story and the lessons we'd learned about sustainable farming and rural economic development. Tomorrow would bring a new group of visitors, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that the best treasures were indeed the ones you worked for and shared with others. The watch ticked steadily in my palm, no longer measuring out seconds of uncertainty but marking the rhythm of a life that had finally found its proper purpose. Dad had been right about foundations. The strongest structures were built on things that couldn't be seen, like trust between siblings, commitment to shared values, and the willingness to transform inheritance into innovation. The Confederate soldiers' gold had provided the means, but Dad's wisdom and Catherine's partnership had provided the vision that turned hidden treasure into visible success. In my shirt pocket, I still carried the original torn letter that had started this entire adventure, its fragments now carefully preserved between sheets of acid-free paper. Sometimes I would pull it out and reread the cryptic clues that had led me to discoveries far more valuable than gold coins or ancient artifacts. The real treasure, I'd learned, wasn't what Dad had buried for me to find. It was what he'd taught me to build with what I'd found, and the family bonds that had been restored in the process of building it together.